They say every heartbeat has a story. Mine stopped, and when it returned, it belonged to someone who could never be mine. I loved the doctor who saved my life, but I woke up on his wedding day. Paragraph 1. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. Before, life moves forward with predictable rhythm, ordinary mornings, small frustrations, familiar routines. But after, everything becomes sharper, louder, and unbearably real. The day my life changed didn't come with warning signs or poetic foreshadowing. It arrived suddenly, violently, and without mercy. One minute I was living a life that felt invincible in its routine, and the next, I was collapsing into a darkness so absolute that it swallowed sound, memory, and even fear. People talk about their life flashing before their eyes. For me, it wasn't a flash at all. It was a silence, a heavy, consuming silence that made me realize how fragile existence actually is. I lost consciousness, not knowing whether I'd ever open my eyes again. Paragraph 2. What we never understand, at least not fully, is how quickly the body can betray us and how helpless we become in those final conscious moments. I remember fragments, like broken glass reflecting random pieces of truth, the panic in someone's voice, the cold tile of the floor, a feeling of being carried, though I couldn't tell by whom. Then came the sensation of floating, suspended between leaving and staying. It wasn't peaceful, despite what people romanticize about near-death experiences. It was confusing, disorienting, and strangely humiliating to feel so entirely out of control. When everything goes dark, you don't think profound philosophical thoughts. You don't bargain or pray or narrate your life like a movie character. You simply fade, helplessly, into something you don't recognize. That was my before the moment I slipped away without slightest understanding of how drastically life was about to change. Paragraph 3. When I woke, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't the soft, cinematic awakening shown in stories. It was a gasp, a violent, desperate dragging of air into my lungs as though I had been drowning in an invisible ocean. My chest burned, my body trembled, and before I could understand where I was, bright lights surrounded me. Everything was too bright, too cold, too loud. My senses were returning faster than my brain could handle. I heard beeping machines, rushed footsteps, and voices speaking urgently just beyond my understanding. My eyelids felt heavy, but I forced them open because instinct told me I had to. That's when I saw him, the doctor who would become the center of my story, leaning over me with a calmness that didn't match the chaos around us. In that split second, I didn't know his name, his role in my rescue, or the weight he would eventually carry in my heart. All I knew was that he was the first face I saw after coming back from the brink of death. Paragraph 4. Coming back to life is not a gentle reunion with reality. It is a shock. My body felt foreign, as though I had borrowed it from someone else. My limbs were weak, my throat was raw, and my heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears. The doctor's voice cut through the noise, steady, low, reassuring. He spoke as if he had known me for years, as if he was personally invested in my survival. I learned later that he had been the one fighting for my life when things looked bleak, refusing to give up even when the outcome seemed uncertain. But in that moment, all I felt was a sense of safety I couldn't explain. His presence grounded me. It told me I wasn't alone, that I had made it through something I wasn't ready to name yet. Life had returned, but it came back to me with consequences, questions, and a quiet awareness that I had been touched by the hands of someone who took my fate seriously. Paragraph 5. The hospital room became my world for days, a world where time slowed and sped up unpredictably. Every beep of monitor reminded me that my heart was working again, that I was breathing again. Every visit from the doctor reminded me how close I had come to losing all of it. He explained everything with gentle honesty, giving me facts before I could even ask questions. He treated my fear with empathy and my confusion with patience. It was strange. The man who had restored my life so skillfully was also unknowingly rebuilding something else inside me, a sense of trust, of connection, of quiet admiration. I didn't fall in love then, not consciously. But something began there, in the fragile space between survival and recovery, where gratitude slowly softened into something more complex. Paragraph 6. Looking back, that moment, waking up to the realization that I had almost died, became the defining line in my life. It was the instant that rewrote my priorities, reshaped my emotions, and shifted the axis of everything I believed about myself. My life had been interrupted, suspended, and handed back to me by a stranger whose hands happened to be the ones guiding me back. This moment wasn't just about survival, it was about rebirth. And with rebirth comes vulnerability, clarity, and an unexplainable attachment to the one who breathed stability into chaos. That life-changing moment didn't end when my eyes opened. It continued, shaping the days that followed, days that would lead to unexpected emotions, unspoken hopes, and a heartbreak I never saw coming. Paragraph 1. In the earliest days of my recovery, when the world still felt blurry and distant, the doctor became more than just a medical figure. He became an anchor in a reality that no longer made sense. There is something profoundly powerful about the first person you see when you return from a place where you almost didn't come back. His presence became a constant, something I found myself looking for even before I fully understood why. In hospitals, everything feels temporary. Nurses change shifts, machines beep unpredictably, visitors come and go. But he seemed steady, almost unmoving, a calm figure amid the chaos. And when you're grappling with the fragility of your own existence, steadiness becomes its own form of hope. I didn't cling to him as a person yet. I clung to the feeling he represented. Safety. Paragraph 2. He walked into the room each day with the same quiet confidence, the kind that didn't demand attention but effortlessly earned it. He explained my condition thoroughly but gently, almost as if he was afraid the truth might break me again. He asked how I was feeling, and though I answered with clinical descriptions, what I wanted to say was this: when you walk into the room, I feel less afraid. It was strange to experience such deep relief at the sight of someone whose job was simply to do what he had been trained to do. Yet the human heart rarely distinguishes between professional compassion and personal care. All it knows is the impression someone leaves when you're at your most vulnerable. And every time he checked my vitals or adjusted my medications, I felt a little more tethered to life because he believed I could stay in it. Paragraph 3. The paradox of being a patient is that you're stuck in place while the world continues moving without you. Days blend, nights stretch endlessly, and your mind becomes both your worst enemy and your only companion. In that suspended world, the doctor stood out like a window letting light into a darkened room. He didn't treat me like a case or a chart or a problem to be solved. He spoke directly to me, eye to eye, with a sincerity that made me feel human again. That sincerity mattered more than any medication or therapy. It reminded me that even though my body had failed me, I wasn't failing as a person. There was someone rooting for me beyond the medical necessity. Someone who saw my struggle, not just as part of his duty, but as a journey he was willing to guide me through. Paragraph 4. Slowly, that guidance became emotional oxygen. He was the first familiar moment in a series of disorienting days. The way he reassured me that I was healing, the way he encouraged me to try taking deeper breaths, the way he celebrated the smallest progress, all these things built an unspoken connection. Not romantic yet, not even consciously special, but undeniably significant. There's a kind of bond that forms between the saved and the savior, a bond rooted not in romance, but in survival. When someone holds your life literally in their hands, something inside you shifts. You feel indebted, grateful, open in ways you never expected. And in my openness, I started to see him not just as the doctor who had brought me back, but as the symbol of everything I desperately needed at the time. Hope, stability, reassurance, and the promise that I would be okay again. Paragraph 5. He became the embodiment of the life I was trying to regain. When he smiled a small, professional smile, it felt like the first clear sunrise after a long storm. When he talked about my progress, I didn't just hear medical updates. I heard possibility, futures, and the kind of hope I hadn't dared to feel in a long time. His presence softened the sharp edges of my fear. I found myself watching the door, listening for his footsteps, noticing the shift in the air when he entered the room. These weren't signs of love, not yet. They were the signs of someone who had placed their entire heart into surviving and unconsciously placed the symbol of that survival into the hands of the one who made it possible. Paragraph 6. Looking back, I realized that I didn't fall for him as a person first. I fell for the idea of him, the symbol he represented during the most fragile chapter of my life. He was hope with a stethoscope. He was reassurance in the shape of a man. He was the promise that despite everything I had lost, someone could still stand steady for me. He didn't know it. I didn't even understand it yet. But in those early days of recovery, he became the emotional foundation I leaned on without hesitation. And once you begin to associate someone with the feeling of being saved, it becomes almost impossible not to let attachment take root. That attachment, subtle at first, would soon grow into something far more powerful, far more complicated, and far more painful. Paragraph 1. Emotional dependence doesn't announce itself with fireworks or dramatic realizations. It grows quietly, almost invisibly, like a vine climbing up a wall unnoticed until you finally look up and see it has covered everything. In the early stages of my recovery, I didn't realize how easily my heart was shifting its weight onto the doctor who checked on me every day. I told myself it was normal to feel comforted by the one who had saved my life. I told myself it was natural to trust the person who guided me through the darkest moment I'd ever known. But what I didn't understand was how vulnerable I truly was, how stripped of emotional defenses a person becomes when facing their own mortality. It wasn't love, yet it was need, a desperate need for stability, for safety, for something that felt like solid ground in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. Paragraph 2. He became a constant in a space where constancy rarely existed. Morning or evening, day after day, he would walk into my room with the same composed expression, the same steady tone, the same reliable presence. And each time, without meaning to, I found myself leaning on that presence a little more. It was the way he remembered small details about my pain levels, the way he checked my charts but still asked how I felt, not just how my body was responding, the way he paused to listen, even when the hospital hallways were calling him somewhere else. Those moments carved a space for him in my emotional landscape. I didn't choose it. My heart simply filled the void with the only thing that felt safe enough to hold on to. Paragraph 3. The strange thing about dependence is that it doesn't always feel like weakness while you're living it. To me, it felt like relief. When he was there, the world felt manageable. The panic quieted, the thoughts slowed, the fear receded. I didn't think of it as attachment. I thought of it as healing. After all, who wouldn't feel deeply connected to the person who brought them back from the edge of death? But healing requires distance, and at that time, distance wasn't something I wanted. His kindness, his attentiveness, his steady confidence, these were the lifelines I clung to without even noticing my grip tightening. It wasn't romantic longing. It was the subconscious belief that if I lost his presence, I might somehow lose the stability I had fought so hard to regain. Paragraph 4. There were moments when his absence felt heavier than it should have. If he missed a round or sent another doctor in his place, I felt disappointment, like a physical ache. I would lie there wondering if something had happened, or if he was simply too busy, or if I should feel embarrassed for caring so much about something so trivial. I told myself it was normal that patients naturally form bonds with their caregivers, but deep down I sensed the beginning of something more complicated. I had begun measuring my days by his presence. Whether I admitted it or not, he had become the emotional compass by which I navigated the uncertainty of my recovery. Every reassurance he offered felt like a promise, even though he never meant it as one. Paragraph 5. The more I healed physically, the more entwined my emotions became. He was patient when I lost confidence, encouraging when I doubted myself, firm when I resisted difficult steps in my recovery. He celebrated small victories with a warmth that felt deeply personal, even though it was simply part of who he was as a doctor. But when you're desperately searching for something to hold on to, the line between professional concern and personal affection blurs so easily. I wasn't in love, yet not truly, but I was relying on him emotionally in a way that made everything he said feel Bigger, heavier, more meaningful than it truly was. He didn't know he was becoming the axis around which my emotional world revolved. I didn't know how quietly I had allowed it to happen. Paragraph 6. By the time I realized how dependent I had become, it was already too late to pull back. He had become the lighthouse in my storm, the steady figure guiding me away from fear and back toward life. But lighthouses aren't meant to be destinations, they're meant to guide you toward your own path. I didn't understand that then. All I knew was that in the quiet hours of the morning, or the long, restless nights when pain made sleep impossible, his presence was the only thing that made the world feel less terrifying. And so my heart, fragile and still rebuilding itself, wrapped around the idea of him in a way that felt natural, inevitable, and comforting. I never intended to depend on him. But emotional dependence rarely comes from intention, it comes from survival. And he had become, unknowingly, the emotional lifeline I relied on as I learned how to live again. Paragraph 1. The day I learned the truth began like any other, with the same fluorescent lights, the same antiseptic smell, the same cautious optimism that came with noticing I could stand a little longer, breathe a little deeper, or move a little more without fear. I had reached a point in my recovery where the world outside my hospital window no longer felt like a distant fantasy. I was healing, truly healing, and every milestone felt like something I wanted to share with him. I didn't say that out loud, of course. I just waited for him the way I always did, listening for that familiar footstep, the soft knock on the door, the quiet "how are we feeling today?" But on this particular morning he didn't come. Another doctor stepped inside instead, offering updates with the same professionalism, but none of the warmth I'd grown accustomed to. I felt the tiniest stab of disappointment, a feeling I tried to ignore but couldn't shake. Something felt different, a shift in the air I couldn't name yet. Paragraph 2. It wasn't until later that afternoon that the truth found me in the most ordinary, yet cruel way. A pair of nurses entered my room, chatting casually as they changed the linens and checked the charts. Their conversation was harmless, light, the kind of everyday workplace gossip that keeps people moving through long shifts. I wasn't meant to hear it, but I did. One nurse laughed softly and said, "Can you believe he's finally getting married today? I thought that man would never settle down." And just like that, the world tilted. The words hit me with unexpected force, knocking the breath from my lungs more violently than any medical episode ever had. My heart didn't stop at fractured. They weren't talking about just any doctor. They were talking about my doctor, the one I had unknowingly built my emotional world around, the one I had tied my healing to, the one whose presence had become the center of my fragile universe. And he was getting married. Paragraph 3. There are moments that feel unreal, moments where your mind refuses to accept what your ears have already heard. I lay there frozen, staring at the blank wall as their conversation drifted off into something else entirely. But I only heard echoes of that single truth. He's getting married today. The simplicity of it made it worse. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't whispered with scandal or surprise. It was a casual statement about a happy event, a celebration, but in my world it felt like the ground had dissolved beneath me. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe for a moment. I simply felt a quiet implosion, the collapse of something I had never fully admitted existed. Emotional dependence, attachment, longing, whatever name it carried, shattered under the weight of a reality that didn't include me, and never was supposed to. Paragraph 4. A part of me felt foolish, almost childish, for feeling so devastated by something that logically should never have been mine to begin with. What right did I have to feel heartbroken? He had never made promises, never hinted at anything beyond professional care, never suggested that I meant anything more than a patient deserving help and compassion. But the heart rarely respects logic. It builds stories out of moments, meaning out of kindness, and hope out of silence. And mine had built an entire emotional reality around him without my permission or awareness. Learning about his wedding wasn't just painful, It was humiliating in a way I couldn't express. I felt exposed, as if the nurses could see the truth written on my face, as if everyone somehow knew the foolish dreams I had carried alone. Paragraph 5. What hurt most was the timing. It wasn't just that he was getting married, it was that he was getting married today. On the very day I had hoped to stand without assistance, to walk across the room, to show him how far I had come. I had imagined quietly, secretly, the relief in his eyes, the shared pride, the moment of connection that had carried me through so many dark hours. Instead, I was left with the knowledge that while I had been anchoring my emotional recovery to him, he had been living a life that had nothing to do with me. He had a future, a partner, a wedding, a world completely separate from the one I had built inside my hospital room. I wasn't part of his story. I had only imagined I was. Paragraph 6. The hours that followed were a blur of numbness. I stared at the doorway, half hoping he might appear one last time, half terrified that he would. I didn't know what I would say, or how I would hide the fracture inside me. It wasn't anger I felt. It wasn't resentment. It was the quiet devastation of realizing that the person who had saved my life, who had unknowingly held my heart together in its most fragile state, belonged to someone else in every way that mattered. My doctor, my symbol of safety, hope, and emotional refuge, had always been someone else's husband. To be. And while the world celebrated his union, I lay in a hospital bed, absorbing a truth that changed everything. Paragraph 1. In the quiet aftermath of that revelation, I found myself confronting a truth I had never prepared for. Love isn't always about claiming, possessing, or being chosen. Sometimes love is something softer, quieter, something that exists purely in the spaces between gratitude and longing. For days after learning about his wedding, I kept replaying every interaction in my mind, every smile, every comforting word, every gentle reassurance he offered me. I sifted through memories like they were clues, trying to understand if I had misread kindness as something more. But the more I examined them, the more I realized that what I felt wasn't the kind of love people write movies about. It wasn't about being with him. It wasn't about wanting him to choose me. It was something more emotional, more internal, a reflection of what I needed at that moment in my life, rather than who he truly was. Paragraph 2. We like to believe that love is a simple, straightforward emotion, but the truth is far more complex. Sometimes the love we feel isn't directed solely toward another person. It's directed toward the version of ourselves they help us discover. When I looked at him, I saw hope. I saw safety. I saw strength. I saw the possibility of a future I had nearly lost. He became the embodiment of everything I was yearning to feel again, alive, cared for, valued. I wasn't falling in love with the doctor as a man. I was falling in love with the life he reminded me I still had. He made me believe I was worth saving, and in that belief, I found a different kind of affection, one born from survival rather than desire. Paragraph 3. This realization didn't come easily. At first, it felt like I was trying to convince myself of a softer truth to ease the sting of disappointment. But the more I reflected, the more I understood that the lines between gratitude, emotional dependence, and love had blurred during my most vulnerable period. When someone becomes the lifeline pulling you out of darkness, your heart doesn't differentiate roles or intentions. It clings, it attaches, it reads comfort as connection. But love, real love, is not built in moments of desperation. It grows in stability, in choice, in mutual recognition. What I felt for him lived in a different category. It was love shaped by survival, not by shared futures or promises. Paragraph 4. It was during this emotional unraveling that I began to understand something essential. Love does not diminish simply because it cannot be returned. The value of what I felt wasn't reduced by the fact that he belonged to someone else. My affection wasn't invalid. It wasn't foolish. It wasn't childish. It was human. I had been through a trauma that reset my entire emotional compass. and he had been the first stable direction I found. That kind of bond doesn't vanish or lose significance just because it remained one-sided. It served a purpose. It kept me grounded when I could have easily fallen apart. It kept me hopeful when fear threatened to swallow me whole. It kept me connected to the world when I had nearly slipped away from it entirely. Paragraph 5, the deeper truth, the one I understood only with time, was that love can be transformative even when it's not reciprocal. His presence in my life taught me what tenderness looked like at a time I desperately needed to see it. His encouragement showed me how to believe in myself again. His calmness taught me how to quiet the storms inside my own mind. And while none of these things were meant to be romantic, they carried a weight that reshaped me. I realized that the love I believed I felt for him was actually a mirror, a reflection of the love I had forgotten how to give myself. He didn't heal my heart by becoming a part of it. He healed it by reminding me that it was still capable of feeling something at all. Paragraph 6. So, slowly, painfully, and with a tenderness I didn't expect, I allowed myself to redefine what love meant in this moment of my life. Love didn't have to mean possession. It didn't have to mean reciprocation. It didn't have to mean a future. Sometimes love is simply gratitude shaped like longing. Sometimes it is admiration wrapped in vulnerability. Sometimes it is the silent acknowledgement that someone helped you rise when you couldn't stand on your own. And sometimes, as hard as it is to accept, the person who awakens these feelings in you is never meant to stay. They are meant to open a door inside you, not walk through it with you. In redefining what I felt, I realized something I hadn't understood before, that love can be both a heartbreak and a blessing at the same time. Paragraph 1. In the days that followed, something quiet but powerful began to shift inside me. The heartbreak didn't disappear, but it softened. No longer something sharp and consuming, instead something heavy. Something that demanded reflection rather than reaction. I found myself lying awake at night, not because of pain or fear, but because I was beginning to see my own journey with new eyes. For so long, I had looked outward for strength, for reassurance, for something or someone to steady me. But now, with the truth settled inside me like an uninvited guest, I began slowly to turn that gaze inward. I had survived something life-threatening. I had endured physical pain, emotional confusion, and the terrifying vulnerability of depending on someone else to hold my world together. And yet here I was, breathing, healing, rising. The doctor had played a part in that. Yes, but the part that kept me alive after the emergency had passed was entirely my own. Paragraph 2. When you strip away the emotional attachments, the longing, the imagined possibilities, you're faced with the raw truth of who you are without anyone else's influence, and that truth can be uncomfortable to confront. I had to admit to myself that I had been afraid of facing life alone after coming so close to losing it. I had latched onto the doctor because he represented safety, but that safety had never been mine to keep. What was mine, however, was resilience. I had made it through each night of pain. I had pushed myself through physical therapy. I had willed my lungs to breathe, my heart to steady, my body to heal. I had been holding on to him, thinking he was my anchor, but maybe he had simply been the mirror reflecting the strength I already possessed. Paragraph 3. As the days passed, I found myself reclaiming pieces of myself one breath at a time. I started noticing things beyond the ache in my chest, the warmth of sunlight slipping through the blinds, the hum of distant conversations in the hallway, the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat, no longer a fragile whisper, but a confident drum. These small details felt like proof of life, proof that my world wasn't collapsing but expanding. I began to speak up more, ask questions, make decisions about my care with more clarity. Each time I advocated for myself, I felt something inside me reconnect, a sense of agency, of ownership, of identity returning. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was quiet, deliberate, the way dawn bleeds into night without rushing. Paragraph 4. And yet, as I grew stronger, I still found myself thinking about him, not with longing now, but with gratitude. I didn't resent him for having a life outside the hospital. I didn't feel anger toward the love he had chosen for himself. Instead, I began to understand that his role in my story was exactly what it needed to be: temporary, pivotal, and transformative. Had he stayed in my life beyond those moments, maybe I would have never learned how to stand on my own. Maybe I would have continued leaning on him emotionally long after my body no longer needed medical care. His absence forced me to confront my own strength. It pushed me toward independence in a way his presence never could have. And that realization felt strangely empowering, painful, yes, but empowering all the same. Paragraph 5. Every day, I grew a little more detached from the fantasy I had built, not by suppressing my emotions, but by understanding them. What I felt had been genuine, but it had also been rooted in vulnerability, fear, and survival. As I acknowledged this, the feelings loosened their grip. I no longer waited for his footsteps or listened for his voice. I began to measure my days not by his visits, but by my progress: how far I could walk, how deeply I could breathe, how confidently I could exist without leaning on someone else's presence. It was liberating in a way I never expected. For the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, I wasn't afraid of the world outside. I wasn't afraid of the future. I wasn't afraid of standing alone. Paragraph 6. By the time I reached a new level of emotional clarity, I understood something that would stay with me long after I left that hospital. Independence isn't the absence of connection. It's the ability to exist fully without depending on someone to make you feel whole. I realized that the love I thought I felt for him had simply been the doorway through which I rediscovered myself. He had saved my life medically, but the process of saving my future, my identity, my emotional stability, that was something only I could do. And in choosing to do it, I felt myself step into a version of me I had never met before, stronger, clearer, braver, and profoundly alive. It wasn't the ending I had imagined in my moments of quiet longing, but it was a beginning I never knew I needed. In the end, I realized that life doesn't always give us the love we want, but it often gives us the love we need. The doctor who saved me was never meant to be the love of my life. He was meant to be the reminder that my life still mattered. He was meant to wake me up not just from unconsciousness, but from the numbness I had been living in long before I landed in that hospital bed. I walked out of those doors not with him by my side, but with something far more important: myself. The version of me who had been afraid, who had sought safety in someone else's shadow, who had forgotten her own strength. She didn't leave the hospital. She stayed behind, gently replaced by someone new. Someone who understood that being saved isn't the same as being chosen. Someone who learned that